Well, thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. And indeed, that question is very much where I'm going to start my comments, because one of my big interests this year is in seeing that the links are made across what's happening here in Paris and all the other big sustainable and resilient development agendas that have been being set this year. And it really is a huge year for sustainable development with this big new agenda, Agenda 2030, and the 17 new Sustainable Development Goals, which were launched in September. But I say it can be a great year for sustainable development if we get a global agreement here in Paris on climate change. And obviously, sustainable development cannot be achieved without decisive action to adapt to and mitigate climate change, which is why Agenda 2030 has this dedicated goal, SDG, Sustainable Development Goal number 13, which calls on all member states, all countries, to take urgent action to fight climate change and its impacts. And when you go into the detail of that goal, it talks about the importance of strengthening resilience and the capacity to adapt to climate-related hazards. It talks about integrating climate change measures into national policies, strategies and planning. It talks about improving education, raising awareness, raising capacity on climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction and early warning. And it also talks about implementing the commitment by developed countries to that goal of mobilising the $100 billion in climate finance annually by 2020. The Goal 13 is also recognising the need to build capacity to tackle climate change in least developed countries and the small island developing states, with a particular focus on women and youth and local and marginalised communities. So all the links from the SDG agenda are there through to what we hope will happen in Paris. And we also have to take into account that much earlier in the year in Sendai in Japan, there was the third UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. And when we're talking weather hazards, we're very much talking now about how you adapt to increased levels of risk with climate, and I'll come back to that. And then there was also the major new financing for development agenda agreed in Addis Ababa. And financing development these days is about drawing on every conceivable source of finance, whether it's public or private, whether it's domestic or international, whether it's environmental or developmental streams of finance. So take these four big agendas together, Sendai, Japan, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the New York SDGs, and now we hope Paris, we really are setting these global priorities for the next generation. So, looking at the challenges and the links across the agendas, obviously climate change threatens to increase the frequency and the severity of natural disasters, disasters which have already cost the global economy $2 trillion over the past 20 years. We are seeing these more frequent severe weather events, the changing rainfall patterns, the sea level rise. We in development see the disproportionate burden of these impacts being carried by the poorest and most vulnerable people and countries with the least means to adapt to what is happening. We're all familiar with what the small island developing states are facing with the encroachment of seawater onto their lands and onto their groundwater, and the threat of the more intense storms. And we've seen such serious damage this year from Vanuatu in the South Pacific through to Bahamas and Dominica in the Caribbean. We see the impact on the drought-prone regions with very poor countries in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, the food insecurity, the poor harvests. These impacts threaten to be more frequent. And then I know there's a major cities stream of discussion here, and we see the world's cities feeling the impacts of climate change with more inward migration from climate-stressed rural regions, and with public services and infrastructure under pressure like never before. And we see many more people coming into these stressed cities also living in quite vulnerable locations with respect to major weather events. Then, as part of the challenge, there's the rate of deforestation, the unsustainable energy practices, all increasing greenhouse gas emissions very fast and exacerbating the challenge. And we would say that failure to invest right now in low carbon development is going to lock countries into unsustainable high emission development, which is far from the low carbon, climate resilient future the world needs. So, what are the opportunities for action? Well, tackling climate change presents, I think, huge opportunities for green growth, green jobs, new sources of exports, stimulation of trade, innovation and new technologies. We see these intended nationally determined contributions, the INDCs, which almost all countries have now submitted pre-Paris, as absolutely central to not only to reaching agreement here in Paris, but also actually in supporting countries to drive sustainable development agendas, preserve and increase their forest cover, invest in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, in sustainable transport and waste management, sustainable cities, and sustainable ways of producing and consuming. So what needs to be done? Well, firstly, climate action, as expressed in all these INDCs which have been submitted, has to be well integrated into countries' development planning. Climate action is not something separate from planning for sustainable development. It's at the very heart of it. We have been working at UNDP directly with 43 countries to finalise these INDCs in the run-up to Paris. And in doing so, we've worked to support the countries to see that the climate action commitments they make build on the local and national development objectives, plans and strategies which they have, and are realistic and actionable. And we believe that acting on these INDCs will help drive sustainable development in each country by encouraging each to pursue that low carbon future and the mitigation actions required to get there. Second, innovative solutions are needed for these twin challenges of climate and sustainable development. And we can build on what is already proven to work in delivering low carbon and climate resilient growth. Some examples of our work: India, where steel production is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. We've been working with local producers, many of them family businesses, to upgrade equipment and the way of producing steel so that they can lower emissions and produce cost savings. We see that as a win-win for climate and for development. Another rather different example comes from Uruguay, where we partnered with both government and the private sector on a new framework to get private sector investment into wind energy. A $30 million investment through UNDP and from the Global Environment Facility then catalysed some $2 billion in private sector investment. 17 wind farms are the result, and actually it contributed to lower retail tariffs for the consumer as well. So there's a lot of wins in this for development and for our climate. Third point I want to make: climate action is a whole of society concern. That means it needs whole of government attention. The role of governments, national and local, is absolutely critical, but other stakeholders need to play their part too. Obviously, how business does business is critical in determining whether countries' climate action plans will succeed. One example of a multi-stakeholder approach I want to mention: Uganda. UNDP has worked there with government, private sector, academic researchers and civil society at the community level to look at what the impact of climate variation on the coffee sector is. This is a critical source of livelihoods and contributor to Uganda's national GDP. It became very clear that even minor changes in climate would impact a lot on the quantity and the quality of the coffee beans produced. And now we can identify that the adaptation needs will include improving storage for the harvested beans, irrigating the land, and planting more climate-resilient coffee varieties. So moves like that will enable local communities to maintain their very important economic sector with coffee. Fourth point: money's not everything, but it always helps. And it is needed for adaptation, for mitigation, for sustainable development overall. And countries, particularly the poorest countries, do need support to build the capacity to navigate and access what is often very complex streams of financing when you come anywhere near climate and environmental finance. So one of the roles we undertake is to support countries to identify what the sources are and how to access it, and to put in place then the institutions, the policies, the laws, the regulations, the budget frameworks, which will enable countries to catalyse and deploy across the various sources of finance which are available. Looking ahead, UNDP has more than 2 decades of experience of climate change work across around 140 countries, and we always have in our mind, how do we advance these big agendas together? How do we roll out the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction and the Financing for Development framework and the SDGs and what we hope will come from Paris and the INDCs? So it's all about joining up these agendas and having them reflected in joined up national plans. So we want to really get in behind countries implementing these INDCs, which so much work has gone into, and to supporting governments to bring all stakeholders in around this national effort. Private sector, civil society, academic researchers, all important to make climate action a reality. So for the next year, definitely focus on implementing the INDCs and also carrying on with the support we give to more than 100 countries on this critical issue of identifying and accessing finance for climate action. So let us hope, Nick, that this week the negotiators are going to agree on the deal, which has been elusive since, I'm not going to say since Copenhagen, but actually elusive since Bali in 2007. And I believe a climate safe and secure future on the planet really hangs in the balance with what is decided this week. We know our world has the resources, it has the capability and ingenuity to rise to the challenge of climate action and achieving sustainable development. But it's going to need very big partnerships right across all stakeholders, and please count on UNDP as a full and committed partner in driving the action which is needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helen. And just before you go, should we be relatively optimistic?
Well, maybe I should.
Well, just about, yes.
Very briefly, I think the ambience is good. What I always say is I'm anticipating an agreement, but it's not the end of the story, because what is being committed in these INDCs on climate action does not keep the world temperature rise below the 2-degree level. It keeps it at puts it at about 2.7, and that's too high. And now, as you know, there's a lot of people coming in saying 2 degrees is too high. So Paris is a very important benchmark, but what I'll be looking for in the agreement is this critical review clause that requires countries to come back and make more ambitious commitments reasonably soon. Can't wait 10 years. Reasonably soon.
Marrakesh next year.
Yeah.
Helen Clark, thank you very much indeed. Great to see you again. Thank you.